What is grief? Grief is a natural response to the experience of a psychological trauma due to a loss. Unlike physical trauma, it is not always visible, but the emotional suffering we feel when something or someone we love is taken away is one of the most stressful experiences in life. The more significant the loss, the more intense the stress will be. You may think that grief refers only to the death of a loved one, but any loss can cause grief, like a divorce, a breakup, or the loss of a friendship, a difficult diagnosis, or a trauma that involves the loss of your physical health, retirement, losing a job, or financial stability, a miscarriage, the death of a beloved pet, or the loss of a cherished dream. Whatever the loss, is normal to grieve because it's personal to you, and with the loss, you're not only grieving the person, the animal, the relationship, or the situation that was significant to you, you're also grieving the part of yourself that the lost relationship represented for you. Learning to let go of that part of you that is lost as well is an important part of the grieving process, and it's part of the ways you practice authentic self-care that brings you growth. In 1969, psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced what became known as the 5 stages of grief. These were described as number 1, denial, when we think this can't be happening to me. Number 2 is anger. This is the stage where we question why is this happening and who is to blame. Unfortunately, oftentimes we tend to blame ourselves, and we enter a vicious cycle of rumination and self-blame that creates an insane amount of stress for our brain in a moment of our life that we are already very vulnerable emotionally, making the healing process longer and more difficult. The third stage is the stage of bargaining, when we start negotiating with ourselves and life. Make this not happen, and in return I will. Or we start contemplating the what-ifs of life. The first stage is depression, when a deep sense of sorrow takes over and we are too sad to do anything. The final and last stage of grief is acceptance, when somehow we find ways of coping with the loss and we are at peace with what happened. If you're experiencing any of these emotions following a loss, it may help you to know that your reaction is natural and that you will heal in time. However, not everyone goes through all these stages or in this sequential order. Also, you don't have to go through each stage in order to heal. So don't worry about what you should be feeling or which stage you're supposed to be in. Some people resolve their grief without going through any of these stages. As Kubler-Ross said, the 5 stages of grief are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is not typical loss. Our grieving is as individual as our lives. Another way to understand the grieving process is to think of it as a roller coaster, full of ups and downs, highs and lows. Like many roller coasters, the ride tends to be rougher in the beginning. The lows might be deeper and longer. The psychological process of healing from a loss is called mourning or grieving. Grieving is a highly individual experience. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. How you grieve depends on many factors, including your personalities, the way you cope with stress, your life experience, your faith, and how significant the loss was for you. It takes time to work through a loss. Even years after a loss, we may still experience a strong sense of grief. Healing happens gradually, and it can't be forced or hurried. Some people start to feel better in weeks or months. For others, the grieving process is measured in years. Whatever your grief experience is, it's important to be patient with yourself and allow the process to naturally unfold. Even if we all mourn in different ways, there are some similarities in how we all mourn, and in particular, there are 4 phases that are part of the mourning process. Acceptance of the reality of the loss, experiencing the pain of grief, adjusting to the environment in which the loss is missing from, and 4th, withdrawal of emotional energy and reinvestment in new relationships or priorities. Sometimes this last step takes the form of a true rebirth of the individual that has been called post-traumatic growth. We will describe this process in a future blog, but it is important to remember that there is hope and light at the end of the tunnel of the grieving process. There is no guide to grieving. However, almost every loss, no matter how expected, will be accompanied by an activation of our stress response. In fact, the National Mental Health Association describes the loss of a loved one as life's most stressful event. As I said earlier, when we experience a loss, at some deep level, we fear for our own very survival. Therefore, the stress response is triggered in our brain and our fight, flight, or freeze response is activated. Our brain is ready to take action, but since we cannot undo the loss, we have no control on the situation and there is no action we can take. We experience a profound sense of powerlessness and helplessness that puts our bodies under enormous stress. This type of stress is particularly harmful to our body and brain because it includes both a major traumatic life event and an ongoing chronic stress experienced after the loss. This chronic stress after the death of a loved one is a combination of many different stressors involved in the process of grieving. These stressors may include the changes that we have to adjust to after the death of a beloved, the intense emotions that the loss generates, including the sense of lack of control and frustrations. Also, sometimes how the loved one dies will have a powerful effect on how we grieve. Sudden deaths, especially violent or accidental deaths, provoke our greatest shock and anxiety. Violent deaths may make us feel vulnerable and fearful or provoke our rage. Suicide may arouse guilt among the survivors. On the other hand, if the death involved having to make end-of-life decisions for our loved one, the level of stress skyrockets. A study conducted by the researchers at the Oregon Health Sciences University found that families who had to make end-of-life decisions for dying patients faced immense stress after the patient died. Or interpersonal stressors. A common source of stress and pain after the death of a loved one is conflict, regret, and hurt feelings among family and friends. Finally, the external pressures. How wonderful it would be if after the death of a loved one, we were given a grace period to grieve. Unfortunately, we often experience the total opposite because we need to take care of a series of tasks that require decisions that we might not be able to make in that vulnerable state. Each of these stressors can increase our levels of stress as each presents different degrees of physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional challenge, and often make us question our fundamental beliefs about ourselves and our world. The death of someone you love can affect both mind and body. During a period of grief, we can experience emotional, mental, and physical symptoms. Emotional symptoms of grief are often a mixture of raw feelings such as sorrow, anguish, anger, regret, longing, fear, disappointment, blame and deprivation, frustration, guilt, shock, and numbness. The physical symptoms of grief can include fatigue, generalized weakness, shortness of breath or tightness in your chest, dry mouth, exhaustion, emptiness, tension, insomnia, and loss of appetite, or a hollowness in your stomach, nausea, lowered immunity, weight loss or weight gain, aches and pains. Behavioral manifestations may include appetite loss or overeating to soothe anxiety. You may experience nightmares or insomnia or just want to sleep the days and nights away. You may feel like retreating socially and crying all day long. The brain is particularly sensitive to the stress of grief. The stress caused by the loss of an attachment to a loved person or of some other significant attachment is usually associated with reduction in problem-solving capacity, reduced access to memory, and deterioration in the clarity of our sense of identity and in our capacity to persevere in the face of the struggle. How can we cope with the stress of grief and overcome grief's health-damaging effects? Though a necessary step for healing, grief is not easy. Research shows that when people don't deal with the emotions of grief, Pain remains, and the stress can become chronic and emerge in unrecognizable and sometimes destructive ways in an attempt to numb the pain. This happens because we are not well prepared to deal with the loss. From a cultural perspective, this happens because we are taught to acquire things, not to lose them, and that acquiring things helps us feel happy or complete. From a social perspective, we live in a society that is not really centered on promoting our mental and emotional health. Therefore, we often don't know how to prioritize or manage our mental and emotional well-being. As we have learned, however, chronic stress has been linked to mental and physical health problems, so it is important to learn and cultivate positive and constructive ways to cope with the stress of grief. Here are some suggestions. Deal with the emotions of grief. Acknowledge your pain. Thinking that the pain will go away faster if you ignore it will only make it worse in the long run. It is necessary to face your grief and actively deal with it. Second, forgive yourself for things you didn't say or do. Third, seek out face-to-face support from people who care about you. Find ways to express your feelings in a tangible or creative way. Balance yourself with rituals of well-being. While you take time for the natural process of healing to occur, remember to support yourself emotionally and physically by taking care of your body, your heart, your mind, and your brain. Practice relaxation and yoga, tai chi, or qigong. Not only these mind-body activities help you relax, but they can reverse the effects of stress and anxiety on a molecular level. According to a study in the June 2017 Frontiers in Immunology, researchers found less activity of genes that create inflammation in the body of people who regularly engaged in these practices. Maintain a healthy diet and follow a good sleep hygiene. Keep moving. A simple daily walk can help ease depression, agitation, and sorrow related to grief. Practice appreciation. In our hearts, we all know that death is part of life. In fact, death gives meaning to our existence because it reminds us how precious life is. Being grateful for what you have will help you renew your priorities. Reach out and overcome isolation. Try to surround yourself with life, plants, animals, friends, and family. Take on new responsibilities. Reach out to your social circle. If helpful, draw comfort from your faith. Join a support group or talk to a therapist or a grief counselor. Recognize the difference between grief and depression. The responses I have described are all normal grief responses to a loss. If they continue beyond few months, you may consider seeking the professional assistance of a mental health practitioner. Doctors classify grief into two types, acute and persistent. Most people experience acute grief, which occurs in the first 6 to 12 months after a loss, and then it gradually resolves. Some, however, experience persistent grief, which is defined as grief that lasts longer than 12 months. Sometimes grief can become associated with behavioral and mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, and panic attacks. In this case, it's called complicated grief. Also, if your loved one's death was sudden, violent, or otherwise extremely stressful, complicated grief can manifest as psychological or PTSD. People who experience persistent or complicated grief or constant symptoms of emptiness and despair more similar to depression should talk to a doctor or a mental health professional to help them work through the grieving process. This may include focused treatment like cognitive behavioral therapy and grief therapy, or the use of antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication. Left untreated, complicated grief and depression can lead to significant emotional damage, life-threatening health problems, and even suicide. If you're feeling suicidal, seek professional help immediately. What can you do for a grieving person? If someone you care about has lost a loved one, you can help them through the grieving process by sharing the sorrow and allowing them to talk about their feelings and loss. You can also offer practical help, babysitting, cooking, answering difficult phone calls, or simply running errands are all ways to help someone who is in the midst of grieving. Be patient and remember that it can take a long time to recover from a major loss. Make yourself available to talk and, if necessary, encourage professional help when you feel that someone is experiencing too much pain to cope alone. No matter what path your grief takes, I'm here to remind you to be patient and kind to yourself. It can take months or even years to absorb a major loss and accept your changed life. But keep hope alive in your heart that you have the power to transform any stress into growth, health, and renewed happiness. I hope this helps in your path to growth and health. Ciao.